Welcome back. Tonight, we explore 120 mysteries buried inside the world of Resident Evil. Questions the games planted and never answered. Details that shimmer in the background of every cutscene. And threads that stretch from the beginning of Umbrella's story to the edges of everything the franchise has become. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. What Spencer actually believed. Oswell E. Spencer gave interview after interview to business publications, to pharmaceutical journals, to civic organizations, in which he positioned Umbrella Pharmaceuticals as an engine of human health and scientific progress. The mystery is not whether he was lying. He was. The mystery is whether any part of what he said reflected a belief he genuinely held at some point before the ambition consumed it entirely. His personal journals, referenced in the files of several games, suggest a man who was once genuinely moved by philosophical ideals about human potential, a real engagement with the idea that science could elevate the species. Those ideals calcified over decades into eugenics, into megalomania, into the willingness to kill millions in pursuit of a vision that started as something almost coherent. The corruption was gradual. The question that the series never fully answers is the moment of the turn, the specific morning or confrontation, where Spencer moved from idealist to architect of atrocity. We never get that moment. The files give us the endpoint and suggest the philosophy, but the internal hinge is gone, possibly never written, and the absence of it makes Spencer more disturbing than any of his confirmed cruelties. Why Edward Ashford never appears. Umbrella was co-founded by three men: Spencer, James Marcus, and Edward Ashford. Marcus appears throughout Resident Evil 0 and the Umbrella Chronicles as a vivid, unsettling presence. Spencer dominates the franchise's mythology. Edward Ashford is almost entirely absent from the games as a living character. He contracted the progenitor virus during early research and died shortly after founding the company. His death is stated, but the circumstances are never fully dramatized. The mystery is whether Edward's death was accidental, as it is presented, or whether Spencer had already begun eliminating anyone whose claim on Umbrella's future might complicate his own plans for exclusive control. The founding charter of the company that would cause the deaths of millions of people was signed by three men, and one of them was gone before the enterprise had even fully begun. The convenience of that timing is something the series acknowledges in outline and never pursues. Marcus's years in isolation. After Spencer moved against James, Marcus, demoting him, reassigning his research, gradually removing his influence from the company's direction, and ultimately having him killed. Marcus spent the final years of his life in the management training facility on the outskirts of the Arklay mountain network in a state of increasing isolation. What the mystery concerns is what Marcus was doing during those years beyond his documented leech research. His laboratory journal entries in Resident Evil 0 become increasingly fragmented and strange, the handwriting deteriorating, the observations growing more ambiguous. He references behaviors in his research subjects that he never clarifies. He records responses from the leech colony that he describes as unexpectedly sophisticated, as if something was being communicated back to him. Whether Marcus's mind was deteriorating under the pressure of his isolation and the awareness of his own displacement, or whether he was genuinely observing emergent behavior in his queen, Leech, long before anyone understood what the Queen Leech was capable of becoming, is never resolved. Both readings have evidence, neither rules the other out. The third founding document. Umbrella's founding is documented in several in-game files that reference a founding charter, formal agreements between Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford, and the original research mandate that the company was established to pursue. What careful readers have noted across multiple entries is that several files reference a third foundational document, separate from the incorporation papers and the research charter, that define the relationship between the founders in terms that differed from the public record. This document has never been reproduced in any game, any file, any unlockable archive. It is referenced and then not shown. Whether it contains something that would fundamentally reframe what we understand about Umbrella's original purpose and the agreements between its founders, or whether the reference is simply a background detail that was never developed into playable content, is one of those questions that the series leaves suspended. The absence of a document that multiple other documents insist exists is its own kind of mystery. Spencer's relationship with the Indipaya. The Indipaya tribe, who tended the garden of the Stairway of the Sunflower for generations, did not simply hand over access to Umbrella when Spencer arrived. The history of that interaction, what Spencer promised them, what was exchanged or taken, whether there was coercion or violence, and what eventually happened to the tribal social structure once Umbrella's harvesting operation was fully established, is almost entirely absent from the canon. Resident Evil 5 takes players into the Kijuju region and shows the aftermath decades later. A population devastated by bioweapon testing, a landscape reconfigured by Umbrella's presence, communities destroyed. But the specific history of the original encounter between Spencer's expedition and the people who had protected the flower for centuries is never told. Somewhere in that gap is the first act of a theft so enormous that its consequences eventually helped unmake entire cities. What Spencer kept in his European estate, the coastal European estate where Spencer spent his final years in hiding, the location of his confrontation with Wesker in the Lost in Nightmares DLC, and the late files of Resident Evil 5, is a building with its own architecture of secrets. Spencer retreated there after Umbrella's collapse and spent years in increasingly frail seclusion. The estate had extensive underground sections, archives, and storage that the game does not fully inventory. What Spencer chose to keep with him in that estate, what research materials, what personal records, what evidence of Project W and of his other programs, and what happened to those materials after Wesker killed him, and before Chris and Jill arrived to find. The body represents a trove of documentation that the series has never accounted for. Someone came to that estate after Spencer died. What they found and what they took is unrecorded. The dead who won't stay dead, where James Marcus's consciousness ends. The final confrontation with the Queen Leech in Resident Evil 0 presents a resolution that the game does not fully explore, even as it dramatizes it. The Queen Leech, having absorbed the memories and physical imprint of James Marcus over the years of their proximity, presents itself as Marcus and appears to genuinely believe itself to be him. When it is destroyed in the resulting fire, the question of what exactly has ended is genuinely unresolved by the game's narrative. Did Marcus's actual consciousness survive in any meaningful form inside the Leech colony? Was the presentation of his identity simply a mimicry so thorough that it had no interior life behind it? An echo without a source? The game's ending does not answer this. Marcus as a character appears throughout the early story as a presence in memories and recordings, then manifests bodily through the Queen Leech, then is destroyed. Whether any fragment of the actual man was present inside that creature when the fire took it is something Zero leaves entirely to the listener. The Crimson Head Elders, the original Resident Evil remake, introduced a mechanic and a mythology simultaneously. Zombies that were not fully destroyed would reanimate as Crimson Heads, faster, more aggressive, and structurally more deteriorated than standard zombies in ways that suggested an advanced mutation stage. Within the remake, there are Crimson Head Elders, further developed mutations distinguishable by additional physical transformation and increased aggression. The mystery is that the progression the game implies has a continuation it never shows. If a zombie becomes a Crimson Head, and a Crimson Head can develop further into an Elder, the logical downstream question is what sustained Crimson Head development produces over a longer timeline than the game's events cover. The Spencer Mansion's outbreak had been active for weeks before STARS arrived. The Elders encountered are implied to be the most developed specimens present. Whether the development pathway has a terminus, and what that terminus looks like, is never addressed. The fate of the Arclay researchers, the Arclay Laboratories research staff who died during the initial outbreak, before the mansion's official discovery in the weeks when the contamination was contained within the facility, are documented in personnel files and diary entries scattered throughout the original games. Their deaths are recorded with varying degrees of detail. Their mutations, in some cases, are encountered directly as enemies. But several researchers who appear in the pre-outbreak documentation are never accounted for in the post-outbreak environment. They neither die on the page in any file, nor appear as enemies in the game. Where they went is not stated anywhere in the available record. Whether they escaped the facility in the early confusion, were removed by an umbrella containment response before STARS arrived, or simply represent narrative threads that were never resolved, is unclear. In a building as meticulously documented as the Spencer Mansion, the missing researchers are a door left conspicuously unlocked. What Lisa Trevor absorbed. Lisa Trevor is one of the most haunting figures in the entire franchise. A woman subjected to continuous viral experimentation over 30 years, from the age of 14, her mother Jessica killed beside her, her consciousness gradually rewritten by the accumulation of experimental strains running through her body. What the files confirm is that Lisa's biology had become something so profoundly novel that even Umbrella's researchers no longer fully understood what she was or what she was becoming. The mystery that the files raise and do not resolve is what Lisa had actually absorbed over 3 decades of continuous experimentation. She was injected with the progenitor virus, with early T-virus strains, with the NE alpha parasite, and with other experimental compounds that researchers were developing in parallel. All of these interacted inside her body for 30 years without producing the terminal outcomes that should have resulted from any one of them. The researchers who created her were, near the end of their documentation, genuinely afraid of what she had become. That fear is recorded. The precise reason for it is not. The last thing, Alexia Ashford calculated. Alexia Ashford injected herself with the T. Veronica virus in 1983 and entered 15 years of self-induced cryogenic dormancy to allow the virus to integrate with her biology at a pace that would prevent the catastrophic mutation it caused in every other host. She emerged in 1998 as something that had genuinely transcended ordinary human biology, capable of controlling organisms, producing extreme temperature phenomena, and sustaining mutations that no other human host had survived. When Chris killed her in Code Veronica, she was mid-transformation into a form the game does not fully show. What the mystery concerns is what Alexia had been doing during the 15 years she spent in cryogenic dormancy. She was not unconscious. The files suggest she remained cognitively active throughout, processing and calculating in a slowed biological state. 15 years of uninterrupted thought. The plan she emerged with feels almost modest given the time she had to develop it. Either she was constrained by something she had not anticipated, or the plan we saw was not the whole of what she intended. What the Queen Leech retained. When Marcus's Queen Leech first emerged from its dormant state and began the process of reconstituting itself into something that could interact with the physical world, it was drawing on 30+ years of proximity to James Marcus's consciousness, his recordings, his journal entries, and his biological presence in the training facility. What the mystery concerns is the specificity of what it retained versus what it reconstructed from insufficient material. The Queen Leech presents Marcus's mannerisms, his voice patterns, his specific grievances, his research obsessions. Some of this detail is so precise that it implies actual memory transfer rather than simple behavioral mimicry. But other aspects of the presentation suggest gaps, moments where the performance thins slightly, where the recall seems reconstructed rather than genuine. Whether the Queen Leech had actual access to Marcus's interior experience or was producing a very sophisticated external imitation is a distinction the game's narrative never draws clearly. The Raccoon City secrets, the police station's original architect. The Raccoon City Police Department building was originally a museum before it was renovated and repurposed as a law enforcement facility. This is established clearly in the game's background materials. What is never established is who designed the conversion, and under what brief. Who looked at a museum layout and decided to retain the ornate stone architecture, the elaborate library, the internal courtyards, and the underground passages, and simply overlay a police procedural function on top of them. The conversion design is either an extraordinary piece of eccentric civic planning, or it was done by someone who had a specific reason to want the building to be difficult to navigate under pressure, full of sections that could be sealed without attracting attention, full of underground access that would not be obvious on a standard building plan. Given what subsequently happened in that building's basement under Chief Irons, the question of whether the unusual layout was entirely innocent is one the games raise and never directly address. The outbreak's patient, Zero in the City, the canonical explanation for the Raccoon City urban outbreak is T-virus contamination of the municipal water supply, seeded from the underground laboratory complex and spreading through the civic water infrastructure over a period of weeks. This is confirmed. But the actual first human case in the city, the first person to present with symptoms severe enough to indicate active infection rather than trace exposure, the specific moment and location where the contamination crossed from passive to infectious, is never identified in any game. The various Resident Evil entries that explore Raccoon City take us into the outbreak after it is already producing visible, unmanageable results. Whether this ambiguity was deliberate on Capcom's part, preserving the horror of an origin that has no single face, or whether the files contain enough detail to triangulate an answer that has simply not been assembled. The first name on Raccoon City's true casualty list remains unrecorded. The role of the Umbrella Security Service, the USS, Umbrella's private military arm, was operational in Raccoon City during the outbreak. They were deployed to retrieve samples and, in the case of the Hunk team specifically, to extract the G-virus from Birkin's laboratory beneath the city. What the mystery concerns is the full operational scope of their presence in the city, beyond those documented retrieval missions. USS units were active throughout the city during the outbreak's worst phase. not simply in the underground laboratory complex. What they were doing in those other locations, what other assets they were assigned to secure, what intelligence they were gathering on the outbreak's progression, and whether any of their operations in the city involved actively worsening the containment situation to prevent civilian testimony from reaching the inquiry that followed, is never fully disclosed. Hunk extracted the G-virus sample and extracted himself. The other teams are unaccounted for. The sewers under Raccoon City, Resident Evil 2, takes players into the Raccoon City sewer system as a significant portion of its geography, and what those sewers reveal is a network far more elaborate than any American city of Raccoon's apparent size would require for basic sanitation purposes. There are mechanized systems, reinforced chambers, passages that connect directly to the Umbrella underground laboratory in ways that would have required extraordinary permits, or no permits at all, processed through channels that Umbrella's financial and political relationships in the city would have made available. The mystery is the construction history of the Raccoon City sewer system. When was it built? Who paid for the portions that exceeded basic municipal requirements? And to what extent was its elaborate secondary infrastructure funded and designed by Umbrella, specifically for the purpose of connecting Nest to the surface through routes that could be used without public visibility? The sewers look, upon careful examination, less like municipal infrastructure and more like the connective tissue of a private underground operation wearing civic clothing. The newspaper that never published. Among the environmental details throughout Raccoon City's levels, there are references to the local newspaper, the Raccoon Press, appearing in prop form and in a small number of readable clippings across the games. What the readable clippings reveal is that the paper had been building toward an investigative story about unusual activity connected to Umbrella's local facilities in the weeks before the outbreak reached its visible catastrophic phase. The journalist pursuing this story is referenced by name in one clipping and never appears again. Not as a survivor in the outbreak games, not as a body in the RPD, not in any subsequent record. The story was never published. Whether the journalist was silenced before the outbreak, began in earnest, fled the city during the early phase, or simply represents a narrative thread that was developed part-way and then set down. The mystery of the Raccoon Press's abandoned investigation is one of the city's quieter, unanswered questions. A story about Umbrella that Umbrella ensured nobody would ever read. What Nest's air systems carried. Nest was a sealed underground laboratory operating beneath a populated city, and like any underground facility of its scale, it required extensive ventilation and air management systems to remain viable for human habitation and research operations. These systems are present in the game's environment as navigational elements and environmental detail. What the mystery concerns is the directionality and the endpoint of those systems. The ventilation for an underground laboratory beneath a city does not exhaust into a sealed space. It connects through various filtration and management stages to the surface. Whether the outbreak, materials generated within Nest, ever reached those surface exhaust points, and whether trace contamination moved upward through the air management system into the city's infrastructure in parallel with the water supply contamination, is a question about Raccoon City's biology that the games touch on through implication and never directly address. The bioweapons that shouldn't exist, the Neptune's breeding program, the Neptunes, mutant great white sharks produced by T-virus infection, are encountered in the Spencer Mansion's water management facilities in the original Resident Evil. They are large, aggressive, and confined to an elaborate enclosed aquatic environment inside a private estate on a mountain. This raises a question nobody in the games ever gets around to asking. What were they actually for? The Spencer Mansion was a research laboratory, not an aquarium exhibit. The Neptunes were not decorative. Research animals of that size and aggression require extensive maintenance infrastructure, refrigerated water systems, feeding protocols, containment engineering, which the mansion has, infrastructure that had to have been built specifically to house them. The mystery is the research program that produced the Neptunes and justified their presence inside the mansion's water management system. What weaponization application they were being developed for, or what research outcome their existence was meant to generate, is never explained. They exist in the water, massive and patient, in an enclosure that somebody designed for them, for reasons nobody recorded. The Plant 42. Origin. Plant 42. The enormous mutant plant organism encountered in the Spencer Mansion's dormitory wing is a T-virus infected botanical specimen of sufficient size and aggression that it has claimed an entire section of the building, its tendrils extending through the structure, its presence detectable by the spreading biological staining across the surrounding walls and floors. The game presents it as an escaped or released experiment. The mystery is the plant's specific origin prior to its mutation. What species it began as, which researcher was responsible for its cultivation, what the intended research outcome was, and how it escalated from a laboratory specimen to an organism capable of occupying an entire residential wing of a multi-story building. In the mansion's greenhouse and laboratory documentation, research focus falls overwhelmingly on animal and human subjects. Plant biology as a primary research stream is not documented. Plant 42 simply exists, enormous and hostile and old. With a history the mansion chose not to record in any file the player ever finds. What the Eliminator monkeys were meant to do. The Eliminators, T-virus-infected primates encountered in Resident Evil 0 aboard the Ecliptic Express and in the management training facility, are characterized by unusual aggression and a peculiar capacity for coordinated group behavior that standard mutation types do not typically produce. They attack with a purposeful quality that distinguishes them from simple infected animals. Marcus's leech research is extensively documented. His primate research is not. The existence of the Eliminators in the management training facility implies a parallel research program that Marcus was running alongside his primary work, one focused specifically on T-virus infection of non-human primates, and one whose intended application has no surviving documentation. Whether Marcus was developing the Eliminators as biological weapon systems, as control test subjects for behavioral studies applicable to human infection, or for some other purpose that the training facility's archive no longer contains, is not stated anywhere in the game's recoverable files. The Thanatos variant. In Resident Evil Outbreak, a giant mutant creature called Thanatos appears as a major encounter at Raccoon City's university, a Tyrant-class bioweapon produced within an academic research environment, rather than in any of Umbrella's primary corporate research facilities. The mystery is the chain of authorization that produced it. Tyrant-class development was not supposed to be a distributed function within Umbrella. It was centralized, restricted, and conducted under specific protocols at designated high-security facilities. The existence of a Tyrant-class specimen at a university laboratory suggests either an entirely unauthorized research program operating completely outside Umbrella's official chain of command, or an officially sanctioned but completely compartmentalized program so covert that it does not appear in any documentation maintained by Umbrella's primary facilities. Either possibility implies something about the real structure of Umbrella's research network that the franchise has never made fully explicit. The Veronica strain's full capability. The T. Veronica virus is presented in Code Veronica as an extraordinary organism, integrated with ancient queen and DNA, capable of producing mutation outcomes that diverge dramatically from standard T-virus results, and requiring a specific cryogenic integration process to prevent the host from being destroyed during incorporation. Alexia was the only person to successfully integrate it, but the experiments conducted on Rockfort Island's prisoner population using T. Veronica show failed integration outcomes. And those outcomes, while catastrophic, display mutation capabilities that Alexia's own transformation did not demonstrate. Several test subjects mutated in directions that Alexia's version of the virus never produced, suggesting the strain has a developmental range significantly wider than what Alexia's single successful integration expressed. The full capability map of T. Veronica, what it can produce under different conditions, different host biologies, different temperature protocols, is something the series has shown only one narrow slice of, and the rest of the range remains unexplored. The Nick specimen, in Resident Evil Outbreak File 2, a Tyrant-class bow called Nyx appears, an organism with the unusual capability of absorbing other BOWs into its mass, incorporating them and using their capabilities as part of its own expanding biological structure. This is a radically different development pathway from any other Tyrant-class organism in the series, and the research program that produced it is not documented in the available files. Which Umbrella facility developed Nyx, what the intended military application of an absorptive tyrant was supposed to be, and how far the development program had progressed before the Raccoon City outbreak released it into the city, are questions the game raises by placing Nyx in the environment and does not answer by explaining its origin. The absorption capability is shown. The research logic behind engineering it is absent. What the T-virus does to intelligence. The T-virus is most commonly understood as an organism that degrades its host, producing zombification, reducing cognitive function to zero, preserving basic motor capability in service of aggressive drive. This is the standard outcome. But the series also shows T-virus infected organisms that retain significant behavioral complexity. The Crimson Heads with their enhanced hunting behavior, the Hunters with their coordinated tactics, certain Tyrant specimens with operational intelligence sufficient to follow specific directives. The mystery is whether the T-virus's effect on cognitive function is genuinely destructive, or whether it is transformative in a way that simply produces a different kind of intelligence rather than its absence. The research documentation within Umbrella's files addresses mutation outcomes, but does not engage with this question directly. What the T-virus does to intelligence when it does not simply obliterate it is something the series demonstrates repeatedly and never fully explains. The women the series never explains. What Annette Birkin knew before. Raccoon City, Annette Birkin, William's wife and Sherry's mother, is encountered in Resident Evil 2 as a woman already operating in a state of controlled crisis, her composure maintained through what appears to be an extraordinary act of will, under conditions of total institutional collapse. She knows what her husband has become. She knows what is happening in the Nest laboratory. She has continued functioning as a researcher despite the catastrophe surrounding her. The mystery concerns what Annette knew, and when she knew it, before any of the September events began. She was a senior Umbrella researcher in her own right, not simply William's spouse. she had independent access to research documentation and laboratory results at a level that would have given her an unusually clear picture of what Umbrella was actually building in the underground facility. Whether Annette made active choices to remain, to suppress what she knew, to protect Sherry by staying inside rather than extracting her, and what those choices cost her, is a story the games reference around the edges and never tell directly. Jill Valentine's pre-STARS background. Jill Valentine's biographical record prior to her appearance in the original Resident Evil is frustratingly sparse. She served in the US Army, then in Delta Force, as one of very few women to complete that selection process. A detail the games establish and then do not develop. How she came to join STARS after a Delta Force career, what her specific operational background was during those military years, and whether any of her prior service had brought her into proximity with anything connected to Umbrella's activities before the Arclay incident, are questions the series gestures at without pursuing. The woman who survived the Spencer Mansion, survived Raccoon City, survived 3 years as Wesker's controlled subject, and eventually confronted him in 2009, came from somewhere specific. A set of experiences that shaped who she became. The Delta Force years are a closed file the series has never opened. Claire's capability before Resident Evil 2. Claire Redfield arrives in Raccoon City, looking for her brother Chris. This is the complete stated motivation for her presence there that night. But Claire, at this point a college student, demonstrates throughout Resident Evil 2 a level of practical competence, mechanical aptitude, weapons familiarity, situational calm under conditions of extraordinary stress, an ability to form functional plans under pressure that suggests a background more complex than the games have explicitly built for her. Whether this is simply the series' characteristic pragmatism about player character capability, or whether there is an intended biographical explanation for how a college student navigates a bioweapon outbreak with this particular quality of composure, is something the games imply and never resolve. She fits into the world of Resident Evil too naturally for someone encountering it for the first time. Nicole's role in the Harvardville incident, in Resident Evil Degeneration, the animated film set between Resident Evil 4 and 5, Senator Ron Davis is entangled in Will Pharma Corporation's bioweapon research in ways that suggest deep institutional knowledge of what Will Pharma was developing and why. The political and corporate structure around Davis implies a broader network of protection for private bioweapon research that extends well beyond the specific individuals shown. A character named Nicole appears briefly in the film's background, with a level of operational specificity in her interactions that suggests the writers intended her as part of a larger story. She disappears without explanation or follow-up. Whether she was a loose thread from a draft version of the film that was trimmed for time, or whether she represents something the Degeneration story expected to develop in a sequel project that never came, is not clear from the available material. Helena Harper's vulnerability. Helena Harper arrives in Resident Evil 6 carrying guilt and a secret the game eventually explains. She was blackmailed into facilitating an assassination attempt on the president because her sister Deborah was being held by Derek Simmons. The blackmail is shown in adequate detail. What is never shown is the prior history that made Helena vulnerable to it specifically. The leverage Simmons used required knowledge of Helena's personal history. Detailed, specific knowledge that takes time to gather and prepare for deployment. Whether Simmons had been building a surveillance file on Helena before identifying her as a useful tool, or whether Helena's past contained something specific that Simmons had found rather than manufactured, is a distinction the game does not draw. The blackmail works. The research architecture behind it is invisible. What Rebecca Chambers did after RE0 and RE1. Rebecca Chambers appears in Resident Evil 0 as an 18-year-old STARS medic encountering the training facility nightmare, and then in the original Resident Evil as a survivor of the Ecliptic Express incident navigating the Spencer Mansion. After those events, she is one of the few STARS members to survive both the mansion and the subsequent Raccoon City disaster. Her post-Raccoon City life, what she did with what she knew, how she processed the trauma, whether she ever testified, what professional path she took from those extraordinary experiences, is almost entirely unaddressed by the main game series. She appears briefly in the Umbrella Chronicles and in Resident Evil 5's files as a university researcher. The decade between the mansion and that research role is lived entirely off camera, and the woman who emerges into academic life from those experiences is never shown making the transition. The government's hidden hand, the Stratcom decision, the nuclear strike that destroyed Raccoon City on October 1st, 1998, was authorized by the President of the United States under emergency authority. The decision-making chain that produced that authorization, who briefed the President, what intelligence was presented about the outbreak's scope and cause, what alternatives were considered and dismissed, and whether anyone in that chain knew at the time of the decision that Umbrella's culpability had already been established internally, is never dramatized in any game or film. An official record of that decision exists somewhere within the fiction. The content of that record, whether the strike was presented as a last resort imposed by impossible circumstances, or as a first preference that certain parties had been prepared to recommend from the moment the outbreak became uncontainable, is a question the franchise has never answered. The FBC's actual mandate. The Federal Bioterrorism Commission appears prominently in Resident Evil Revelations as an organization whose director, Morgan Lansdale, has manipulated a terrorist attack on Terra Grigia to justify the FBC's expanded authority and funding. The mystery that extends beyond Lansdale personally is the FBC's institutional history before his corruption of it. Lansdale did not build the organization from nothing. He inherited a structure and then bent it toward his own purposes. What the FBC looked like before Lansdale's influence reached its leadership, what genuine bioterrorism prevention it may have accomplished in its earlier years, what institutional values it was founded with, and whether the organizational structure that allowed Lansdale to operate as he did was something he introduced or something he recognized and exploited in a bureaucracy that was already susceptible to it, is never explored in any available material. What intelligence preceded the Raccoon City strike, the US government's decision to authorize a nuclear strike on an American city, required an intelligence justification of extraordinary weight. The specific intelligence products that informed that decision, the satellite imagery, the human intelligence from sources inside or adjacent to the city, the assessment documents that characterize the outbreak's nature and Umbrella's role in it, are never shown in the games. What intelligence agencies knew about Umbrella before Raccoon City, and what they knew about the T-virus specifically, shapes the entire character of the government's response. Whether the strike was authorized with full knowledge of Umbrella's culpability, which would imply a cover-up of extraordinary scale, or with genuinely incomplete information that presented no viable alternative, changes the moral character of every subsequent government action in the series. The intelligence record does not exist in any accessible file. The BSAA's founding compromises. The Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance was founded in 2003, 5 years after Raccoon City, by a consortium of pharmaceutical companies called the Global Pharmaceutical Consortium. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine are among its founding operatives. The structure of this arrangement, a private corporate consortium funding an international counter-terrorism force, is acknowledged in the games as unusual and potentially problematic. What is never addressed is the specific compromises that were embedded in the BSAA's founding structure by the GPC's involvement. Every organization funded by private interests carries the fingerprints of those interests in its operating constraints. What the GPC specifically prohibited, required, or shaped in the BSAA's operational mandate in exchange for its funding is not documented. Whether those constraints had any effect on the BSAA's response to specific incidents is impossible to assess without knowing what they were. Derek Simmons' lineage in the family. Derek Simmons, the National Security Advisor revealed in Resident Evil 6, as the leader of an ancient globalist organization called the Family, is shown as the most recent inheritor of a lineage of control that predates him by generations. The Family is described as having shaped world events for a very long time. The mystery is what the Family was doing during the specific decades covered by the Resident Evil timeline. During Umbrella's rise, during the Raccoon City disaster, during the bioterrorism proliferation of the 2000s. An organization of the Family's alleged age and reach, operating in the same world as all of those events, cannot have been simply watching them from a distance. Whether the Family had contact with Spencer, with Umbrella's structure, with the post-collapse bioweapons market, is never addressed. Simmons is introduced and destroyed. The institution that produced him is left standing without its history being examined. What the US government built after Raccoon City, the Raccoon City disaster produced in the world of Resident Evil an extraordinary quantity of new information about bioweapon capabilities, outbreak dynamics, infection vectors, and the specific properties of the T-virus and G-virus under urban deployment conditions. Governments do not receive this quantity of operationally relevant information about a new category of weapon and do nothing with it. The US government's classified biodefense and bioweapon research response to Raccoon City. What programs were initiated? What research was funded? What conclusions from the outbreak were translated into capability development is never shown. Leon Kennedy's government career and the DSO's existence suggest institutional infrastructure. The specific programs that infrastructure was built to support are invisible in the available record. The experiments nobody documented, the NE-alpha parasite program's earlier subjects, the NE-alpha parasite, the neural override organism injected into Lisa Trevor and subsequently absorbed by her biology in a way that killed the parasite rather than the host, was developed as a control mechanism intended to grant external management of a BOW subject's behavior. This is established in the files. What is not established is the full scope of the NE-alpha program before Lisa became its most documented subject. She was far from the first. The development of a parasite sophisticated enough to provide neural override of a human host required extensive intermediate stages, early animal testing, failed human trials, progressive refinement of the delivery mechanism, and the parasite's neural integration capability. These stages are referenced in aggregate form in the available documentation, but never itemized. Who the NE-alpha was tested on before Lisa Trevor, and what happened to those subjects, is a chapter in Umbrella's archive that no game has opened. The training facility's other students, James, Marcus ran the Umbrella Executive Training Facility in the Arklay Mountains, selecting Umbrella's next generation of researchers and identifying the most promising for advanced positions. The facility's two most famous graduates are Albert Wesker and William Birkin, who are extensively documented because of who they became. But the facility had other students. The dormitory records in Resident Evil 0 imply a student population significantly larger than these two names. What happened to Marcus's other trainees? Whether they advanced into Umbrella's research hierarchy, were quietly redirected to less sensitive positions, or whether some of them became subjects in the leech research that Marcus was conducting in the facility's lower levels, is not tracked in any surviving record. Wesker and Birkin are documented because history made them important. The others are names in a register that no game has ever shown. Operation Javier's full casualty record. In Resident Evil, the Dark Side Chronicles, the operation to neutralize cartel leader Javier Hidalgo, who had used his criminal resources to acquire T-virus strains and subject the people under his territorial control to viral experimentation, is told from the perspective of Leon Kennedy and Jack Krauser. The mission produces outcomes the game documents for its main characters. What it does not document is the full scope of what happened to the civilian population of the River Territory under Javier's control. These were people who had been subjected to viral experimentation over a period of years, who had survived in various states of infection and mutation, and who were located in a remote jungle region during a classified paramilitary operation. What the mission's official outcome recorded for those people, whether they were evacuated, medically assessed, left in place, or quietly resolved under the operation's classified mandate, is never stated in any available record. What Birkin was developing. Alongside the G-virus, William Birkin's research record at Umbrella covers his early T-virus contributions and the G-virus work that became his consuming obsession. But Birkin was a prolific researcher, operating in a fully equipped underground laboratory for years, and the G-virus was his priority project, not his only project. Side experiments, parallel research threads, compounds and processes developed in service of understanding the G-virus that had potential applications of their own. The research environment at Nest would have generated enormous volumes of secondary work. What happened to that secondary research when Nest was lost is never addressed. Some of it presumably went with Hunk in the data packages accompanying the physical G-virus sample. What Umbrella recovered, what was destroyed in the outbreak's chaos, and what remains in a flooded underground laboratory beneath a city, whose surface no longer exists, represents an unknown quantity of bioweapon-relevant research that has never been accounted for. The Rockfort Island prisoner population. Rockfort Island, Umbrella's private military and research facility in the South Atlantic, held a prisoner population that served as test subjects for ongoing research programs, as established in Code Veronica. The prisoners who appear in the game are those who survived long enough to be encountered by Claire during the facility's outbreak. The mystery concerns the overall prisoner population and its origin. How did people end up as test subjects on an island facility that officially did not exist for purposes of prisoner housing? Umbrella's private island facility can't have been receiving prisoners through official channels. No government was shipping inmates to a pharmaceutical company's private research island. The network of acquisition, the specific means by which people were identified, taken, transported, and delivered to Rockfort without any of those steps appearing in any accessible record, is never documented in any game. the Sheena Island processing operation. Sheena Island, featured in Resident Evil Survivor, was an Umbrella-controlled island facility dedicated specifically to Tyrant mass production, the cultivation and growth of Tyrant-class BOWs from the basic biological material the production process required. The production process, as established in the game, required a specific biological input that the facility harvested from unwilling human subjects. Young people lured to the island and processed. The full operational history of Sheena Island, how long it had been running, how many subjects had passed through it, what logistical systems maintained the supply of both material and cover for a production facility of this scale, is given only the barest sketch in the game's available documentation. The island existed. It processed people. The infrastructure of that process is almost completely invisible. The cold storage contents at Nest. Nest's laboratory complex contained extensive cold storage facilities, specialized environments for preserving biological specimens, viral samples, experimental compounds, and research materials that required controlled temperature environments to remain viable. The cold storage sections of Nest, visible in Resident Evil 2, contain material that the game does not fully inventory. The T-virus strains, G-virus samples, and experimental BOW specimens that are documented are likely a fraction of what the facility's cold storage actually held at the time of the outbreak. Research materials that required cold storage were not taken by Hunk's team, were not destroyed in the outbreak's initial chaos, and were in sealed preservation units capable of surviving the facility's destruction, may still be viable within the flooded and sealed remains of Nest beneath the ruins of Raccoon City. Whether any of them are, and what they contain, is an unanswered question. The Survivors Who Changed. Leon Kennedy's 6-year transformation. Leon Kennedy's evolution between his appearance as a rookie police officer in Resident Evil 2 and his appearance as a polished government operative in Resident Evil 4 is one of the most dramatically complete character transformations in the series. The 6 years between those games, during which Leon was recruited by a government agency, trained, deployed, and eventually assigned to the President's personal protection detail, are referenced but never shown. What specific events during those years shaped the operational approach we see in Resident Evil 4? Who trained him, and in what specific disciplines? What missions did he run before Spain, and what did those missions cost him? The man who arrives at the Spanish village is carrying 6 years of experiences that produced him, and the games have never shown what those experiences were. Chris Redfield's lost year in Eastern Europe, between Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. Chris Redfield had a breakdown severe enough to cause him to abandon his post and his identity, to lose his memory of the events that triggered it, and to be found by his BSAA colleagues in a bar in Eastern Europe with no recollection of who he was. The game tells us the trigger was the loss of his entire squad in a mission against Neo-Umbrella forces. But the specific events of that mission, what happened in sequence, what Chris witnessed, and why this particular loss broke a man who had already survived losses of extraordinary magnitude, are shown only in fragmented flashback. The mystery is what made this specific incident categorically different from everything else Chris had endured. He had watched people he cared about die before in circumstances that were harrowing. Something about this one was different. What that difference was is never fully stated. What Ada accumulated between RE2 and RE4. Ada Wong disappears from the events of Resident Evil 2, having transmitted the G-virus sample to her employer, having apparently sacrificed herself to allow Leon to escape, and then having survived in a manner that neither Leon nor Sherry directly observed. Between Resident Evil 2 in 1998 and her reappearance in Resident Evil 4 in 2004, Ada was operational in the world of bioweapons intelligence for 6 years. The operations she ran during that period, the employers she moved between, and the intelligence she gathered from each of them, the degree to which she was actively monitoring Wesker's post-Raccoon activities, and the specific information that gave her the operational foreknowledge she demonstrates in Resident Evil 4. All of this happened in documented series time and is represented by an almost complete absence of available information. Ada's 6 years are the most valuable and least documented stretch of the franchise's intelligence history. Sherry's custody years. Sherry Birkin was taken into government custody after Raccoon City. At 12 years old, with G-virus genetic material integrated into her biology through her father's embryo implantation and the subsequent vaccine that suppressed active mutation without fully clearing the viral presence. She emerged from government custody years later as a DSO agent with the remarkable healing capability and apparent biological stability that the G-virus integration had produced over her development. The years between those two appearances, the entirety of Sherry's adolescence and early adulthood, spent inside a government protective and almost certainly research-adjacent program, are not dramatized. What was done with her during those years, how she was treated as both a person and a biological resource, and how she arrived at the decision to serve the government that had been studying her since she was 12, are questions Resident Evil 6 raises through her character and does not answer. What Jake Muller knew about his father. Jake Muller, introduced in Resident Evil 6 as a mercenary with Ouroboros-resistant antibodies in his blood, later revealed as Albert Wesker's biological son, grows up without knowing his father's identity. This is established. The mystery concerns the specifics of what Jake did know about his origins and when. He knew he had a father he had never met, clearly. He knew enough about his own history to understand he had been raised without paternal presence and to carry some version of that absence as a biographical fact. Whether Jake had ever been told anything specific about his father, a name, a profession, a description, or whether his father's identity was entirely blank in his personal history, shapes the character of his reaction to the revelation in Resident Evil 6, in ways the game does not fully explore. What Jake thought he was before he knew what he was is never shown. Barry Burton. After the mansion. Barry Burton, Jill's fellow STARS member in the original Resident Evil, compromised by Wesker's threats against his family, survived the Spencer mansion and subsequently relocated his family to Canada to keep them safe from the consequences of what had happened and what he knew. His life between the Spencer mansion in 1998 and his appearance in Resident Evil Revelations 2 in 2011 spans 13 years that include the Raccoon City disaster, Umbrella's collapse, the founding of the BSAA, and the entirety of the bioterrorism proliferation era. Barry is a trained operative with direct personal knowledge of Umbrella's BOW capabilities from the original incident. What he did with that knowledge, whether he maintained any connection to the ongoing intelligence world, and how he spent the years before his daughter Moira's capture pulled him back into active involvement, is a personal history the series has never told. The locations that hide more than they show. The Spencer Mansion's unvisited areas, the Spencer Mansion as explored in the original Resident Evil, and the remake covers an extensive geographic footprint, the main building, the courtyard, the dormitory wing, the underground laboratory, the waterway network beneath. but the mansion's architectural blueprints, used as a navigational tool in the game, indicate sections of the building that are marked as existing spaces and are never entered by the player under any circumstances. These are not simply rooms that were cut from final production. The map marks them as present within the building's structure. Whether these spaces contain additional research records, additional biological specimens, additional passages connecting the mansion to the broader Arklay Mountain infrastructure, or simply the ordinary backstage architecture of a building, is left to inference. The map shows rooms the game never takes you into. The Nest Laboratory's outer perimeter. The Nest Underground Laboratory beneath Raccoon City is a substantial research complex with multiple distinct sections. The primary research floors, the sewage connection points, the Tyrant production and holding areas, and the executive and administrative sections. What is established in the narrative but never fully mapped in the playable environment is the laboratory's outer extent. Nest is presented as vast, larger than what the player traverses. The sections accessible in Resident Evil 2 represent a portion of a research complex that the game's own architecture implies extends further in several directions than the player ever reaches. Whether the unvisited sections of Nest contained additional research programs, additional BO specimens, or additional personnel who died or evacuated before the player arrives, is a question about a real physical space within the fiction that no game has answered. Rockfort Island's second research wing. Rockfort Island is primarily known through Code Veronica as a military training and detention facility with an attached research component, but supplementary materials and within-game files reference a secondary research area on the island that handled different research classifications from the main complex, work that was separated from the primary facility for reasons the available documentation does not specify. The secondary area's location on the island, its specific research mandate, and its precise fate during the Rockfort outbreak are not established in the playable game. Whether it was overrun in the outbreak, whether it was successfully isolated and sealed before the contamination reached it, or whether its contents and personnel were evacuated before the island's operational capacity was destroyed, is information the game acknowledges exists and does not provide. The village before Los Iluminados, the unnamed rural Spanish village where Resident Evil 4 begins, is, by the time Leon Kennedy arrives, already fully in the grip of the Las Plagas infestation. The villagers are hostile. The social structure has been fundamentally reoriented around Osmond Sadler's cult hierarchy. But the village before this, as it existed before Los Iluminados arrived and introduced Las Plagas to the population, had a history, a social structure, and an ordinary life that the game implies was recognizable Spanish rural existence. How Los Iluminados came to this specific village, what the initial infection event looked like from inside the community as it was happening, and how long the transformation from ordinary village to what Leon encounters actually took, are questions Resident Evil 4 places in the background and leaves entirely there. What's beneath the Baker estate? The Baker estate in Resident Evil 7 reveals itself as a layered location. The main house, the old house, the processing barn, the salt mines. What the game establishes about the mold's biological spread through the estate implies a network that extends beneath the visible architecture in ways the game shows consequences of, but does not fully map. The underground sections connected by the mold's growth suggest a substrate beneath the estate's foundations that the explorable areas represent only partially. The full extent of the mold's underground biological network at the Baker estate, how deeply it runs beneath the soil, what biological material it has processed and incorporated over the years of Everline's occupation, and what might remain active in that substrate after the events of the game conclude, is left open by a narrative that resolves at its surface and not at its root. The Connections facility where Everline was made. The Connections, the black market bioweapons developer responsible for creating Everline, operated a research facility where the E-Series biological weapon was designed and developed. This facility, its location, its research staff, and the full scope of the program that produced Everline are referenced in the available files, but never shown directly in any game. The research environment that created an organism capable of producing the mold, establishing a biological network across an entire estate, and maintaining cognitive control over multiple infected individuals simultaneously represents a research achievement of significant complexity. The facility that housed that research, what other projects it was running alongside the E-Series, and what happened to it and its personnel after Everline was lost during transport, are gaps the series has not filled. The viruses that behave wrong, the Ouroboros compatibility threshold. The Ouroboros virus was designed to serve as the ultimate expression of the progenitor concept, a substance that would integrate with genetically compatible humans and destroy everyone else. This selection mechanism is established as the virus's core design function. What is never explained is the biological mechanism by which it selects. The specific genetic or biochemical markers that Ouroboros reads in determining host compatibility, the process by which it reaches a binary outcome of integration versus catastrophic rejection, and the percentage of the human population that would theoretically survive contact with it. All of this is absent from any file or dialogue within Resident Evil 5. Wesker's stated intention was to expose the global population to Ouroboros through atmospheric dispersal. The virus would produce the outcome he wanted. The biology that would determine which humans lived through that outcome is not documented anywhere in the canon. The mold's memory architecture. The mold in Resident Evil 7 demonstrates behaviors that go well beyond what any fungal organism should produce under any biological model the real world has generated. It creates a shared consciousness network between infected individuals. It preserves and transmits specific memories across that network. It allows Everline's controlling intelligence to direct the behavior of infected people across physical distances without any apparent transmission medium beyond the mold itself. How the mold accomplishes this at a biological level, what mechanism it uses to carry specific memories between infected hosts, how Eveline's consciousness interfaces with the network, and whether the network has any practical range limitation or could theoretically extend indefinitely given sufficient mold density, is never addressed in the game's available files. The effects are shown. The biology is not. The Plaga's underground sentries, Las Plagas in Resident Evil 4, had been dormant in the soil of the rural Spanish region for a period described in the game's documentation as centuries, an indeterminate span of deep time before Los Iluminados excavated and reactivated the parasite population. The Plaga, in its dormant state, requires specific conditions to begin its infectious cycle, and something maintained it in dormancy for that extraordinary span of time, rather than allowing it to reactivate independently. What those dormancy conditions were, what originally triggered the dormancy, and whether the dormancy was a natural phase of the organism's life cycle or a response to some external environmental pressure that eventually changed, is never explained. An organism sophisticated enough to provide the neural integration capability Las Plagas demonstrates does not have centuries of dormancy by biological accident. The Plaga's geological patience implies a biology far more complex than the game develops. The T-Abyss variant's open water potential. The T-Abyss virus featured in Resident Evil Revelations was engineered from deep-sea organism DNA for optimal function in aquatic environments, a T-virus variant specifically designed for marine deployment. The Queen Zenobia and its sister ships provided the testing environment. The T-Abyss virus, as a waterborne pathogen engineered to function in the ocean, released into a contained shipboard environment, raises an obvious question the game does not address. What would happen if it reached open water in sufficient quantity? The ship was a contained testing environment. The virus's intended application, per its design mandate, was oceanic. Whether the T-Abyss virus introduced to open ocean would produce ecological effects far beyond what the shipboard outbreak suggests, and whether any containment breach during Revelations resulted in trace T-Abyss contamination reaching the surrounding ocean, is never assessed in the game's narrative. The progenitor's natural history. The progenitor virus is isolated from the stairway of the sunflower in West Africa, an ancient organism growing in a specific location, tended for generations by a tribe who had prolonged contact with it. The virus's actual age, how long it had existed within the flower's biology, how it came to be there in the first place, and whether it evolved within the flower as a natural product of that botanical organism's biology, or was something older that the flower was simply serving as a host for, is never addressed. Spencer's expedition encountered an organism that had apparently been present in that location for a very long time. None of the Enderpire's centuries of proximity to it had produced outcomes resembling what Umbrella's subsequent research generated. Whether the progenitor was biologically benign before Umbrella's intervention, or always contained the potential that Umbrella extracted from it, is the deepest question about Resident Evil's natural world that the series has never asked. What the C-Virus replaced. The C-Virus, appearing in Resident Evil 6 as the bioweapon of choice for multiple antagonist organizations, is a compound pathogen developed by combining the G-Virus with T. Veronica, two of the series' most extreme viral organisms fused by Carla Radames under Neo Umbrella's research mandate. The research process that produced this combination, the intermediate experiments, the failed fusion attempts, the progressive refinements that eventually produced a stable compound strain, is not documented in the game's available files. The C-Virus, as shown, has specific capabilities: chrysalid transformation, the production of Javo, with their adaptive mutation response, and specific pathways to BOBU-class outcomes. How many failed versions of the C-Virus were produced before the stable version? What those failed versions did to their test subjects? And whether any of the intermediate strains are still present somewhere in the Neo Umbrella research chain is a question about the most dangerous virus in the series that the game's narrative does not engage with. The organizations behind the organizations. What restructured after Umbrella dissolved? Umbrella was declared bankrupt and dissolved following the Raccoon City legal proceedings. Its physical assets were seized, its patents pursued, its personnel scattered across a pharmaceutical industry that was suddenly flooded with extremely capable researchers who had been working on classified programs and had nowhere obvious to go. An organization of Umbrella's scale, with distributed research programs, proprietary technology that competitors had been trying to acquire for years, and a personnel base with unique expertise, does not simply cease to exist when a court declares it dissolved. The black market ecosystem that emerged in the years following and drove the bioterrorism proliferation, documented between 1998 and 2006, was built from Umbrella's remnants. The specific organizational structures that formed, who organized them, what prior Umbrella relationships they drew on, whether any were directly continuous with Umbrella operational cells rather than simply assembled from scattered personnel, is never mapped. How Tricell acquired Umbrella's research legacy. Tricell, the pharmaceutical and energy conglomerate that funded Wesker's operations in Resident Evil 5, is presented as Umbrella's functional organizational successor, carrying forward bioweapons research under a different name. The connection between Tricell and Umbrella is established through Excellegione's role and Wesker's relationship with the company's bioweapons division. What is not established is how Tricell initially acquired the research capability that allowed it to serve this role. Whether Tricell executives made contact with Umbrella personnel before the company's collapse and began the transfer of knowledge before the legal proceedings concluded, acquired Umbrella research assets through the bankruptcy proceedings, or recruited key personnel independently and built their capability from that human capital, is never detailed. The acquisition of a research legacy worth billions happened somewhere in a gap the games do not show. Who funded the underground infrastructure? Umbrella's research at Nest and the Arclay Laboratory required capital investment on a scale that challenges any simple explanation. The Nest Underground Laboratory alone, its construction, its equipment, its maintenance, its personnel, would represent hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. The public-facing pharmaceutical division generated substantial revenue, but the spread between what legitimate pharmaceutical operations could plausibly have generated and what the underground research infrastructure required is significant enough to demand an explanation the series never provides. Where the gap was funded, whether through classified government research contracts that provided capital under alternative program labels, through private sources connected to Spencer personally, through financial structures that did not appear in Umbrella's public filings, or through some combination, is a question about the money behind the atrocities that the games have never answered. The Connections research portfolio, the Connections, the black market organization responsible for developing Eveline in Resident Evil 7, is shown to have sophisticated research capability sufficient to create a biological weapon of genuinely novel design. The E-Series project that produced Eveline was not their first or their only research program. An organization with the scientific capability shown in their Eveline development would not have applied that capability to a single project. What else the Connections was developing alongside or before the E-Series? What other bioweapons or biological technologies they had brought to various stages of completion? And whether any of those projects survived the loss of Eveline and continued to develop after the events of Resident Evil 7, is information the game does not provide about an organization whose full research agenda has never been disclosed. Who was watching? Ethan Winters. Ethan Winters, before the events of Resident Evil 7, was a civilian systems engineer whose wife had disappeared 3 years prior. During those 3 years, multiple parties with interests in Mia and in Eveline were aware of the Louisiana situation to varying degrees. The Connections was looking for Eveline. Chris Redfield's organization was monitoring mold-related incidents. Various parties with intelligence interests in the Connections were presumably tracking the disappearance of one of their operatives. Ethan, as the civilian anchor point for Mia's cover identity, would represent an obvious surveillance target for any of these parties trying to locate her. Whether Ethan was being watched during those 3 years, by whom, and what any of those observers concluded about what he knew or what he represented, is never addressed. The man arrives at the Baker estate, having spent 3 years as a potential intelligence target, and none of that surveillance, if it existed, is ever acknowledged. The questions the series has never answered. How many people survived Raccoon City? The nuclear destruction of Raccoon City is presented as near total. The games follow specific survivors whose escapes are documented. The Outbreak games follow other civilian survivors navigating various routes out of the city, some of whom succeed and some of whom do not. But the complete accounting of Raccoon City survivors, how many people were outside the city when the outbreak began? How many escaped during the early phase before the government closed the perimeter? How many reached official evacuation points? And how many survived in ways that never appeared in any official record, is never provided. Raccoon City's population was substantial. The number of people who lived through what happened to it is a question the games deliberately leave without a precise answer, and the gap between the confirmed survivors the games follow and the total number is filled by an accounting that has never been done. Whether William Birkin is truly gone. William Birkin's G mutation follows a biological logic fundamentally different from T-virus infection. The G virus drives continuous, escalating mutation through a process that incorporates biological material into an expanding and changing structure. A process whose defining characteristic is that it does not stop. By the end of Resident Evil 2, Birkin has been destroyed by Nest's self-destruct sequence. But the G virus's core property is that standard destruction paradigms do not apply to it in the ways they apply to other biological organisms, whether anything of the G organism that William Birkin became. In the sewers, in biological material that Nest Systems had been processing for weeks, in the water table beneath the destroyed city. Survived the facility's destruction is a question the game resolves with apparent finality, while the biology of the G virus refuses to let it rest entirely. Where Alex Wesker's research network went, Alex Wesker's operation on same island in Resident Evil Revelations 2 involved years of research into fear as a mechanism for activating the T-Phobos virus's full capability, using a captive subject population who had been lured to the island under false promises and subjected to systematic psychological and biological experimentation. After the island's events conclude, there are threads in Alex's research network that the game's ending does not resolve. Research personnel who had been working on the project had operational knowledge of the T-Phobos program. Communication infrastructure had been maintained with outside parties who were receiving research outputs. The subject population of the island beyond the game's principal characters had been processed through the fear experiments. What authority eventually arrived at Same Island, what they found there, and what was done with Alex's research materials and surviving subjects is not addressed. The Megamycete's actual age. Resident Evil Village establishes the Megamycete, the vast fungal organism buried beneath the Eastern European village, as extremely ancient, predating the village's recorded history and serving as the biological source of the Kadu parasite and the foundation of Miranda's research. The Megamycete's age is described in terms that suggest geological rather than historical timescales. An organism of that age, buried in that location, did not simply arrive there. Its presence implies a natural history, how it came to be in that specific location, what it was before Miranda found it, whether the village was built above it by coincidence or because the landscape's unusual properties drew settlement. That is almost entirely absent from the game's available lore. Miranda researched the Megamycete for decades. Its history before she found it is essentially untouched. What Eveline was ultimately building. Eveline, the mold-based bioweapon in Resident Evil 7, constructed the Baker estate situation through a methodology that reflects something beyond simple aggression or the random expansion of infection. She wanted a family. She rebuilt a family structure using mold-controlled subjects and attempted to incorporate Mia, and eventually Ethan, into that structure. Whether this behavior reflects something programmed into Eveline as a feature of her engineering, a motivation implanted by the connections to ensure she sought out and captured new hosts, something that emerged from her psychological development as an engineered child consciousness that was never properly socialized, or something that the mold's own biological agenda was driving through processes Eveline was not fully in control of, is never clarified. The connections created a consciousness and lost control of what it wanted. Whether what Eveline wanted was hers or the mold's is the question Resident Evil 7 poses most quietly. Whether Spencer found his heir, Spencer's Project W, the eugenics program that produced the Wesker children, was designed to culminate in a single superior inheritor who would carry forward Spencer's vision with the biological advantages that the progenitor experiments were meant to confer. Albert Wesker was identified as the surviving male subject. Alex Wesker was Spencer's chosen candidate before she pursued her own path. But Project W had other participants whose fates are less completely documented. Other children given the Wesker surname, other experimental subjects who passed through earlier phases of the program in the years before the final cohort. Whether any of those earlier participants survived their viral exposure, whether any of them are alive within the series continuity, and whether Spencer ever came close to finding the heir he was looking for before Wesker's fist ended his search, is a question about a program whose full participant list has never been shown. What the mold will eventually remember. The mold in Resident Evil 7 preserves memory as a biological function. Eveline uses it to replay traumatic events at specific locations in the Baker estate, the mold serving as a medium for experiences that have been absorbed into its biological structure. The mold that grew through the estate's structure had been present, in biological contact with every significant event that occurred there, for years. It absorbed the Baker's experiences, Mia's experiences, and the experiences of every person brought to the estate during Eveline's occupation. If the mold preserves memory as a property of its biology, then whatever mold remains in the Baker estate, in the walls, in the soil, in the biological traces that could not be fully cleared by the events of the game, retains an archive of everything that happened in that place. What the mold remembers, and whether that memory is accessible to anyone who might eventually come to examine what remains, is a question the series raised and then moved past without resolving. How much Chris knew before. Village's opening. Chris Redfield's appearance in Resident Evil Village's opening sequence, during which he appears to shoot Mia Winters and take Ethan's daughter, is designed to be disorienting. The subsequent explanation that the woman he shot was Miranda, not Mia, and that Chris was already operating with intelligence about Miranda's capabilities and her role in the situation, resolves the surface confusion, but creates new questions about the specifics. How long had Chris been aware of Miranda? What did he know about the relationship between the megamycete, Eveline, and the mold's presence in Mia's biology? What was his plan for Ethan before Miranda's intervention disrupted it? The intelligence background of Chris's operation in Village is narrated in outline and not in detail, and the full picture of what he knew before everything went wrong is never reconstructed for the viewer. Whether Ethan was continuous, the revelation in Resident Evil Village that Ethan Winters had been clinically dead since the opening events of Resident Evil 7. That the mold had reconstructed him as a functional biological entity after Jack Baker destroyed his heart, and that he had been living as a mold-sustained reconstruction throughout both games, is one of the franchise's most significant retroactive revelations. What it does not answer is the continuity question it raises. Whether the Ethan who lived through Resident Evil 7 and 8 was genuinely continuous with the Ethan who entered the Baker estate. Whether his memories, his sense of self, and his subjective experience of being a person were preserved by the mold or reconstructed from biological traces in a way that only resembled continuity, is left unresolved. The game reveals what Ethan was. Whether the person the player inhabited for 2 games was really Ethan Winters is a question the revelation makes harder, not easier to answer. What Miranda tried before the Megamycete. Miranda spent more than a century pursuing the resurrection of her daughter Eva, lost to the 1919 Spanish flu. The Megamycete became her instrument, the biological mechanism through which she believed a true resurrection might be possible. But Miranda arrived at the Megamycete through a path that preceded her discovery of it, and that path has almost no documentation in the available lore. A woman with Miranda's scientific capability, pursuing a single goal for over 100 years, would have exhausted other avenues before settling on the fungal organism beneath the village. What those other avenues were, how far she pursued each of them, and what she learned from the failures that eventually led her to the Megamycete, is a research history the series has touched on only in the briefest outline. The century before the Megamycete is essentially empty on the timeline the games provide. What happened to the Cadu after Village? The Cadu parasites distributed by Miranda to the Lords of the Village used to create the biological horrors of Resident Evil Village represent a derived organism produced from the Megamycete's biology. With Miranda's death and the Megamycete's destruction at the end of Village, the primary source of Cadu production is gone. But the Cadu that had already been distributed and incorporated into the village's population, into the Lords, and into the various creatures encountered throughout the game, are not recalled or neutralized by Miranda's death. The biological material that the Cadu represents is now present in whatever remains of the village's environment after the events of Village conclude. Whether that biological material remains viable, whether it retains any infectious capacity without the Megamycete's controlling network, and whether any of it has been recovered by parties with bioweapons interests, is a question the game's ending does not address. What happened to Moreau's Lake? Salvatore Moreau, one of the 4 lords of the village in Resident Evil 8, a Cadu-enhanced figure who controlled the reservoir and its surrounding structures, had transformed the lake environment through his biological presence in ways that extended beyond his personal mutation. The water environment of Moreau's domain, in contact with his biology for an extended period, had absorbed biological material that the game shows consequences of in the creatures inhabiting it. After Moreau's death, the lake remains, a large body of water that had been in sustained biological contact with a Cadu-enhanced organism for years. What the water chemistry of that lake looks like after the events of Village, whether it retains any biological hazard, and whether the creatures that inhabited it during the game's events continue to exist in the environment after the source of their mutation is gone, are questions the game does not consider after Moreau is no longer its concern. If you made it this far, through all 120 mysteries wound through the long and layered history of this franchise, leave a like and subscribe if this kind of slow, immersive storytelling is what helps carry you toward sleep. The weapons that disappeared, the G-virus sample, after RE2, Hunk successfully extracted a physical G-virus sample from Nest and delivered it to Umbrella. This is confirmed in the canon. What becomes of that sample after delivery? Which Umbrella facility received it? What research program it was fed into? And whether it was one of the assets transferred to Tricell after Umbrella's collapse, or was seized in the legal proceedings that followed, is never tracked in the available material. A physical G-virus sample delivered by Hunk to Umbrella's corporate chain in late 1998 as one of the most valuable research assets in the world of bioweapons development should have left a trail of custody documentation as it moved through Umbrella's system. That trail does not exist in any game or supplementary file. The most important biological material to come out of Raccoon City vanishes into Umbrella's infrastructure and is never accounted for again. Where the remaining T-virus strains went, Umbrella's research across multiple facilities had produced numerous distinct T-virus strains, variants developed for different research programs, different host applications, different environmental conditions. When Umbrella collapsed, the institutional chain of custody for these strains dissolved with it. Some were presumably seized in legal proceedings. Some were presumably in facilities whose locations were not known to the authorities conducting those proceedings. The proliferation of bioterrorism incidents in the years following Umbrella's collapse drew on T-virus material that had to have originated somewhere in Umbrella's distributed storage network. Whether a complete inventory of Umbrella's T-virus strains was ever produced by any government agency conducting the post-collapse investigation, and if so, whether that inventory matched what subsequently appeared on the black market, is a question the series has never addressed. The mercenary market after RE5. Following the events of Resident Evil 5, in which Wesker's plan for global Ouroboros dispersal was stopped, and both Wesker and Exceller Gion were killed, Tricell's bioweapons division was effectively destroyed as an operational entity. Its research archive, its remaining personnel, and its physical inventory of biological materials represent an enormous quantity of operationally relevant content that was not destroyed in the events of the game. The disposal of Tricell's bioweapons infrastructure, who conducted it, under what authority, with what degree of completeness, and whether any material from Tricell's research program survived into the black market in the years following, is never addressed in any subsequent game. The aftermath of the world's most ambitious bioweapon program being dismantled is treated as concluded by the end credits. What Jack Krauser left behind. Jack Krauser, former Delta Force operative turned mercenary and eventual agent of Sadler's operation in Resident Evil 4, had a career between his apparent death in a training accident and his reappearance in Resident Evil 4 that is referenced but not fully disclosed. During those years, Krauser was working with Ada Wong on Operation Javier, suffered the injury that effectively ended his conventional military career, and was subsequently recruited into whatever network eventually connected him to Sadler's operation in Spain. The intelligence connections Krauser maintained, the organizational affiliations he developed during those years, and whether any of the relationships he built survived his death and continued to exist in the world after Resident Evil 4's events concluded, is a biographical history the series touched on in the Dark Side Chronicles and did not complete. The Plaga specimens after RE4. The Las Plagas parasite population centered in the Spanish village was, by the end of Resident Evil 4, effectively destroyed. Sadler dead, the island facility destroyed, the primary Plaga population eliminated. But the parasite had been actively distributed to hosts for long enough that physical specimens, separated from their hosts in the course of the game's events, would exist as biological material in the aftermath. Whether any government or private intelligence operation conducted a thorough sweep of the village and island environments after the events of Resident Evil 4 to account for surviving Plaga specimens, and if so, what was found and what was done with it is never addressed. The Plaga is an organism of extraordinary capability that was present in a recoverable form in a specific geographic location after the game's conclusion. Its fate in that location is unrecorded. The secrets of Umbrella's inner circle. What Birkin told Wesker, privately. William Birkin and Albert Wesker had been colleagues since their days as young students at Marcus's training facility, and their professional relationship continued through their parallel careers within Umbrella for years afterward. This long history implies a depth of candid communication that existed outside the formal institutional record. Conversations about Umbrella's true nature, about Spencer's plans, about what each of them was building and why, that were never committed to any document. What Birkin shared with Wesker privately, beyond what the files record, and beyond what their coordinated actions imply, is a gap in the series' most important relationship. Two people who knew Umbrella's darkest secrets from the inside, who trusted each other enough to exchange information they kept from everyone else, had conversations that no available record has preserved. The day Spencer decided to use Wesker. At some point during Albert Wesker's development within Umbrella's research and intelligence structure, Spencer made the specific decision to activate the Wesker surname's significance, to begin treating Wesker as Project W's primary candidate rather than simply as a capable research asset. When this decision was made, what prompted it, and whether Wesker was ever given any indication that his status had changed, or whether he remained unaware of what he represented until the information was useful to Spencer, is never documented in the games. Project W's existence was disclosed to Wesker only in the confrontation where Spencer revealed it as his origin story. Whether that disclosure was the first time Wesker knew, or whether he had assembled the truth from indirect evidence years earlier, is not established. What Umbrella's board knew. Umbrella Pharmaceuticals maintained the external structure of a legitimate corporation, which implies the existence of a board of directors, senior executives, and various categories of investor, whose formal positions required some level of disclosure about the company's actual activities. What Umbrella's nominal board knew about the underground research programs, whether they were complicit, whether they were systematically deceived, or whether the board structure itself was a fiction staffed by Spencer's associates who had been incorporated into the scheme, is never addressed in the games. Corporations don't run bioweapons programs in their own name without either the board's knowledge or an extraordinary architecture of institutional deception. Which of those was true of Umbrella is a question about corporate governance in the most catastrophic research organization in the series, whether Wesker had other sleeper agents. Wesker's operation throughout the series relied on his ability to maintain covert assets, people positioned inside organizations who were providing him with information and operational support while appearing to serve other masters. Ada Wong is the most prominent example, but Wesker's operational sophistication and the scale of what he was attempting suggests a network of position assets that the games show only partially. Whether Wesker had other sleeper agents inside institutions the series presents as straightforwardly aligned, inside the BSAA, inside various governments, inside the organizations opposing him, is suggested by the competence of his planning and never confirmed by the game's narrative. The visible edges of Wesker's network imply a larger center that was never fully shown. What Spencer wrote in the last year. Spencer spent his final years in the coastal European estate in declining health and increasing isolation, aware that the bioterrorism world he had inadvertently helped create was producing consequences he had not fully anticipated. During that period, he was apparently reflecting on what he had done and what he intended, enough to have orchestrated the circumstances of his own discovery by Wesker. Whether he wrote during those years, memoirs, analysis, additional planning documents, or simply personal reflection, and whether any such writing survived his death and the subsequent arrival of Chris and Jill at the estate, is not established. Spencer was a man who had kept meticulous records throughout his life. That he stopped in his final year is possible. That his final year produced no writing worth noting seems inconsistent with who he was. The biological mysteries, what Wesker's blood actually was. Albert Wesker's post-resurrection biology, the result of the prototype progenitor virus that Birkin had provided him, combined with his own genetic material and the physiological trauma of the T-002 tyrant's attack, is described in general terms throughout the series: enhanced speed, enhanced strength, regenerative capability, and the specific superhuman attributes he demonstrates in combat. What is never precisely characterized is the actual biological structure of Wesker's altered blood and tissue. His biology is distinct enough that exposure to Ouroboros proves lethal rather than integrative, a response the game presents as an interesting detail and does not explain mechanistically why the Ouroboros virus, specifically designed to accept progenitor-compatible hosts, would reject the most progenitor-modified human in the series, is a question about viral biology that Resident Evil 5 raises and sets aside. The P-30 compound's origin. The P-30 compound used by Wesker in Resident Evil 5 to control Jill Valentine, counteracting her resistance to his influence by being administered through a mechanism attached to her chest, is a pharmaceutically sophisticated product. It suppresses independent will while preserving motor function and operational capability at a level precise enough to make Jill an effective covert agent while preventing her from acting against Wesker's interests. The research program that produced P-30, the testing history that refined it to the precision shown in Jill's operation, and whether P-30 was a tri-cell development, a Wesker personal project, or something with an older lineage in Umbrella's pharmaceutical research, is never documented. The compound works with specificity that implies extensive development. The development is invisible. What the Las Plagas does to memory. Las Plagas infection in Resident Evil 4 produces ganados, infected humans who retain significantly more cognitive function than T-virus zombies, capable of using tools, following instructions, communicating within their group, and engaging in coordinated behavior that requires operational intelligence. What they appear to lose, compared to their pre-infection selves, is discussed only in general terms. The mystery concerns the specific effect of Plaga integration on the host's memory and personal identity. Whether Ganados retain memories of their pre-infection lives, whether the person continues to exist inside the Ganado alongside the parasite's influence, aware but unable to act independently, or whether the Plaga displaces personal memory and leaves only the behavioral framework the parasite directs, is a question about the interior experience of Las Plagas infection that the game never addresses from inside. How Eveline aged backwards. Eveline in Resident Evil 7 presents to Ethan as an old woman, a deliberately assumed form that she uses as part of her psychological manipulation of the Baker estate's environment. This is not her biological form. which is that of a young girl. Whether Eveline's ability to present a false physical appearance to observers represents an actual biological capability, the mold reshaping her physical presentation, or whether the aged woman Ethan encounters is a mold construct separate from Eveline's actual biological body, operating as a kind of projection, is not explained in the game's available files. The mechanism by which Eveline creates the aged appearance, and whether the appearance has physical substance or is purely a perceptual manipulation enabled by mold exposure, is something Resident Evil 7 presents as a reveal without explaining as a biology. What the fungal network under the village processed. The megamycete beneath the Romanian village was an organism of extraordinary age embedded in the earth beneath a community that had existed above it for generations. During all of that time, during the centuries or millennia, the village existed above the fungal organism. The megamycete was biologically active. It was producing spores. It was processing organic material in its environment. It was doing what fungal organisms do, which includes breaking down and absorbing biological material in the surrounding soil. The village's dead, buried in the earth above the megamycete for generations, would have been in biological contact with an organism that preserves memory as a function of its biology. What the megamycete processed from the village's accumulated dead, what it absorbed from the biology of people who had lived above it without knowing it was there, is a question Miranda, despite her decades of research, apparently never asked. The broader world of Resident Evil. What other countries were watching. Umbrella. Umbrella's reach was international. Research facilities across multiple continents, pharmaceutical distribution throughout the developed world, research personnel from numerous countries, and a product line that reached government health programs globally. The US government's awareness of Umbrella's true activities has been touched on through the post-Raccoon City narrative. What other national intelligence services knew about Umbrella? What they had assembled from their own surveillance of the company's activities, and what actions any of them took independently of the American response, is a dimension of Umbrella's international operation that the series has almost entirely ignored. A company operating covert bioweapons research across multiple continents would have attracted the attention of multiple national intelligence services. What any of them did with that attention is absent from the canon. What the global media made of Raccoon City, the destruction of Raccoon City, a mid-sized American city, population approximately 100,000, destroyed by what was officially described as a contained but extreme emergency requiring a military response, would have been the most significant domestic news event in the United States in decades. The global media coverage of the event, the official explanation that was provided, the credibility of that explanation given what journalists were able to observe and document during the outbreak's visible phase, and the degree to which the subsequent cover story held against international journalistic scrutiny, is never shown in the games. Raccoon City's destruction was public. The story the world was told about it is referenced but not dramatized, and whether that story held, and for how long, is something the series treats as resolved without showing the resolution. Whether bioterrorism got worse after RE6, Resident Evil 6 is set in 2013 and presents a world in which bioterrorism had become a sufficiently common threat to justify an international counter-terrorism force in the BSAA. The events of the game, which include the Tall Oaks outbreak, the Lanshan attack, and the revelations about the C virus's global distribution capability, are presented as a crisis point, but the franchise's post-RE6 entries have not provided a clear account of the global bioterrorism landscape in the years that followed. Whether the events of Resident Evil 6 produced a sustained increase in bioterrorism activity, as the widespread distribution of C virus material during the game's events might plausibly generate, or whether effective international response contained the aftermath, is not established in any subsequent game's stated world state.